Espaço Público está de volta e hoje conversa com a professora e militante Angela Davis. Lembrando que hoje o programa é gravado e não haverá participação ao vivo pelas redes sociais. Antes de prosseguir nosso debate, vamos relembrar um pouco da luta contra o racismo nos Estados Unidos.
Ao lado do Brasil, os Estados Unidos foram um dos maiores destinos de navios negreiros, que trouxeram mão de obra cativa da África. A escravidão alimentou a economia americana por mais de 2 séculos e só foi abolida após uma guerra civil na qual morreram mais de 600 mil pessoas. Apesar da abolição, o racismo sobreviveu como uma herança duradoura e profunda. A discriminação foi definida em lei e a violência contra os negros era tolerada pelas autoridades. Inconformados com o fim do cativeiro, em diversos estados do Sul, nasceram braços da Ku Klux Klan, organização terrorista que sequestrava, torturava e assassinava cidadãos negros. Pregando a superioridade do homem branco, o grupo se manteve até as vésperas da Segunda Guerra Mundial, quando o esforço para vencer o nazismo e reconstruir um país destruído na Grande Depressão abriu a porta das Forças Armadas e das grandes empresas a trabalhadores negros. A luta contra a segregação ganhou força na década de 1950, quando homens e mulheres desafiavam leis que proibiam negros frequentar os mesmos bares, restaurantes e escolas que brancos. Num episódio que fez história no estado de Alabama, a costureira Rosa Parks se recusou a dar seu lugar no ônibus para uma pessoa branca, atitude que levaria a um boicote às empresas locais de ônibus. A luta pelos direitos civis produziu lideranças importantes, como o pastor luterano Martin Luther King, que recebeu o Prêmio Nobel da Paz em 1964, depois de organizar marchas e protestos pacíficos sem paralelo na história dos Estados Unidos. Outra liderança, só que mais radical, foi Malcolm X. E na década de 60, que tanto ele quanto Martin Luther King foram assassinados. Protestos violentos surgiram em várias cidades, mostrando que a população negra não aceitaria passivamente qualquer iniciativa para diminuir direitos recém-conquistados no governo John Kennedy. Embora estejam longe de levar a mesma vida de conforto e oportunidades da sociedade branca, os negros conquistaram nos últimos anos novos espaços na economia, na cultura, nas universidades e na política. Em 1967, um antigo advogado ligado aos direitos civis, Thurgood Marshall, tornou-se o primeiro negro a ocupar uma vaga na Suprema Corte dos Estados Unidos. Em 2009, Barack Obama tomou posse como o primeiro presidente negro da história americana.
Ângela, uma boa parte das pessoas que nos enviaram perguntas pelas redes sociais perguntam sobre os Panteras Negras. Perguntam sobre sua participação nos Panteras Negras, se você foi militante dos Panteras Negras. A maioria das pessoas acredita de alguma forma você participou desse movimento que durou uma certa época e foi uma coisa importante, né? Eu gostei, acho que é uma boa oportunidade de você esclarecer tudo isso aqui para todas as pessoas.
Well, yeah, it's somewhat complicated. First of all, I should say that I have supported and defended the Black Panther Party from the very outset. I was studying in Europe when the Black Panther Party was founded, and it was because I heard about this new moment in the development of the struggle for black liberation that I returned to the States. I actually was a member of the Black Panther Party in 1967, 68. I worked with one of the offices in Los Angeles. I was in charge of political education and did quite a lot of work with the Black Panther Party. However, I was a member of the Communist Party at the same time. This is actually, I'm realizing now, it was 68 in 1968, because I joined the Communist Party in 1968. And I was also a member of the Black Panther Party. And those who were higher up in the leadership structure of the Black Panther Party decided that people could not be members of 2 parties. So I had to choose, would I remain a member of the Black Panther Party, or would I remain a member of the Communist Party? And I chose the Communist Party, but I continue to have cordial relationships with the Black Panther Party and worked with that organization until its demise.
Dizem que é de pequeno que se forma o caráter do homem. Você acha que as escolas hoje e a sociedade de maneira geral está conseguindo fazer esse ensinamento? Eu lembro que na campanha passada da reeleição de Barack Obama, um dos candidatos usou um slogan na camiseta falando: vamos colocar um branco de novo na Casa Branca. Isso não é um mau exemplo?
Well, first of all, I do think that education can make a difference. I grew up in a family where both my mother and father were educators, so I was exposed to education at a very early age. And I know that it was that education that allowed me to imagine a different world, even as I was forced to live in a world of violence and racial segregation. I always point out that my mother used to say, this is not the way things are supposed to be. Things will be different one day. And I think that is the role that education should play. It should play the role of encouraging people to imagine themselves in the future, imagine themselves differently. And of course, when Barack Obama was elected, it was interesting that most people said, I never imagined that this would happen in my lifetime. The campaign was extremely racist, and you're absolutely right. People talked about putting a white man in the White House, or put the white back into the White House. But when Barack Obama was elected, it was only one black man in the White House, and a black prisoner said at that time, there may be one black man in the White House, but there are 1 million black men in the big house, which is the prison, of course. But getting back to education, I think that the role that education currently plays in the U.S., at least, is very negative, because schools have become places where there are metal detectors and oftentimes policemen and guards that are armed. And so young black children of color, learn where they're supposed to be educated. They're not being educated, and they learn how to be treated as prisoners. They learn discipline, rather than acquiring knowledge. And they learn to have their imaginations stifled, as opposed to learning how to imagine themselves in the future in a world that is less riddled with racism and violence.
Angela, durante o Festival Latinidades, a socióloga norte-americana Patricia Hill Collins falou que nesse ambiente escolar, o ativismo, a iniciativa das crianças e das crianças negras tem sido podado desde o início. Você observa essa dinâmica acontecendo no ambiente escolar e também fora dele, uma criminalização dos movimentos sociais e também das formas de protesto das pessoas que se engajam nesses protestos de rua. Você observa que isso tem ocorrido?
Well, it certainly has been happening in the U.S. The criminalization of political resistance goes, all the way back to it goes back to W.E.B. Du Bois, who spent time in jail. One can talk about Martin Luther King and his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, the 50th anniversary of which we celebrated last year. One can look at the imprisoning of Native American, indigenous activists. And so the message that sends to young people is that if you get out of line, if you challenge the status quo, if you stand up for justice, you're going to be punished. And this is why I think 40 years ago, the campaign around my case was so important. Because even though the most powerful forces in the U.S., we're talking about Richard Nixon, who was president, and Ronald Reagan, who was the governor, and J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, they were all determined to have me sentenced to death. And people said no. People stood up all around the world. And that was an important victory. So I don't think people should be afraid to engage in activism, but they should recognize that it's about building communities. It's not about an individual standing up. It's about creating communities of resistance, communities of struggle. And if we are attacked, if we are criminalized, we fight back, and eventually we win.
A senhora pensa que esses movimentos de resistência eram mais fortes há 40 anos? Porque eles conseguiram vitórias que hoje parecem difíceis de igualar. Né? Quer dizer, prisioneiros ficam presos e cumprem pena de prisão. Né? Tem casos nos Estados Unidos que, assim, ou seja, existe os movimentos sociais perderam força? Ou estão sem direção? Como é que a gente vê aí? Como é que a gente pode pensar? Existe uma crise nesse movimento social?
Well, of course, conditions were very different 40 years ago. There was this palpable sense of the possibility of a victory over capitalism. People felt connected across geopolitical boundaries. But also, there were things we didn't know 40 years ago. In a sense, things were a lot easier because we didn't understand the complexity of struggles against racism, for example. And I often point out that many of us thought that to challenge racism, we were calling for freedom for the black man. And we did call for freedom for the black man. And it was only later that we realized that we had left women out of the whole picture. And so in order to deal with racism, we also had to deal with sexism. And so struggles became more complicated. We began to talk about intersectionality, the relation between race, class, sex, issues of sexuality, issues of gender aren't so clear as they were before, because we have to recognize that there are people who don't necessarily identify as male or female. There are people who identify as trans, people who identify as gender non-conforming, and we have to take all of these things into consideration. We know now that we have to consider settler colonialism. Wherever it is, settler colonialism as it emerged in the U.S., but settler colonialism in occupied Palestine, because Israel is really the only settler colonial state that continues to try to expand in the 21st century. And so the question is, how do we attend to all of these complicated issues, and how do we understand the connections and interlinkages? So I think that now we are in a much better place, a much better position to build movements that will bring about lasting change than we were 40 years ago. We may have experienced victories more easily 40 years ago, but now we have the consciousness, the awareness, and we have the technological tools. Oftentimes we allow the new modes of communication to control us, rather than using them as technologies to bring together communities, all over the world. So I'm actually quite excited about possibilities today.
Agora, eu podia fazer uma pergunta. Nós ouvimos a cientista social e diretora do Instituto de Pesquisas e Estudos Afro-Brasileiros, Elisa Larkin Nascimento, viúva do professor Abdias do Nascimento, que foi um dos pioneiros da luta contra o racismo no Brasil. Elisa nos enviou uma pergunta. Vamos ouvir.
Angela Davis, saudações. É um prazer poder dizer da nossa solidariedade de muitas décadas. Eu e meu marido, Abdias Nascimento, estivemos com você em Durban em 2001, durante a terceira Conferência mundial contra o racismo. E, partindo daí, eu gostaria de lhe perguntar como ver a situação do racismo hoje nos Estados Unidos, país que, um pouco parecido com o Brasil, que se diz não racista por causa da miscigenação, hoje tem um presidente negro, né? Fica uma situação, aquela negação do racismo. Como você vê hoje a existência do racismo contra a população negra nos Estados Unidos e no mundo?
Yes, it is true that with the election of Barack Obama, many people assume that we were entering into a new phase, what has often been called a post-racial phase. But we've recognized that the impact of racism is perhaps stronger now than before. And as I was saying in a previous conversation, we have to understand the structural power of racism. It is not simply the racist attitudes that continue to persist and will persist as long as racism is a powerful social, economic, and political force. There is the case of Donald Sterling, who was the owner of the basketball team, the Los Angeles Clippers, and he made some racist comments in private, which of course were spread all over the world, and he has been forced to sell his team. Now, I'm not saying that he shouldn't be held accountable, but that is not the racism that we should be so concerned about. We should be concerned about the racism that does really major damage to human beings, all over the country. Now, we are in a situation where there are more black people in power, and black people who have a visibility in movies, on television, as heads of corporations. That often conveys the impression that things have changed substantively. But we see black people in positions of power engaging in the same strategies that white people used, and so nothing has changed. It's just that the bodies of a few people have changed, and that is not a way to imagine the end of racism. Everyone, black people and people of color, moving up the economic and political hierarchy. We have to change the whole system, and that is the challenge facing us today.
Eu queria retomar aquela questão do capitalismo que a senhora estava falando agora há pouco. A senhora participou do movimento Ocupa Wall Street e a gente vê atualmente uma crise mundial do capitalismo, principalmente na Europa. Os Estados Unidos acabou de passar por uma grande crise e parece que o poder do dinheiro, dos mercados, continuam determinando o futuro do planeta. Eu queria saber a sua posição com relação ao conflito no Oriente Médio. Quando que o mundo vai conseguir realmente pacificar aquela região e dar o direito aos palestinos de terem a sua nação?
Okay, yeah, two questions. One, the rise of global capitalism, and two, the situation in occupied Palestine, the Israel-Palestine issue. First, I think it's really important to thank those who participated in the Occupy movement. Because the Occupy movement made it possible for us to engage in open critique of capitalism for the first time, perhaps, since the 1930s. And therefore, the anti-capitalist consciousness of not only in the U.S., but in other parts of the world where the Occupy movement arose, is much greater. With respect to the situation in the Middle East and what many people are calling, what the United Nations has called Israeli apartheid, I am really troubled by the failure of progressive people all over the world to turn towards Palestine and to say, no, this should not be happening. Human beings should not be treated in that way. Many people are afraid that if they endorse the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement called for by Palestinian civil society, that they will be charged with anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism has nothing to do with supporting the struggles for freedom of the Palestinian people. As a matter of fact, so many, especially young Israeli Jews, are standing up against the Israeli state, just as we in the U.S. stand up against the U.S. state, even when Barack Obama is president. And so now, of course, we see the horrendous violence that is being visited upon people in Gaza, the children who are being killed. I think that black people have a special responsibility because we're looking at the inheritances of racism. We have the technologies of racism that the State of Israel uses. We're looking at a connection between the prison industrial complex in the U.S. That incarcerates vast numbers of black people, and the creation of a situation in Palestine that looks like prison, even when people are supposedly living in the free world. Palestine, Gaza especially, as it has been pointed out, is the largest open-air prison in the world. So I think we should understand those connections.
Agora vamos fazer um breve intervalo e voltamos em instantes com a entrevista com Angela Davis. Até já.